This episode of The Dig, like every episode of The Dig, is produced in partnership with Jacobin magazine. Jacobin is an incredible publication, and you've probably seen a lot of what they've published online. But they also have a really beautiful print magazine. It comes out quarterly and has well over 100 pages packed with illustrations, infographics, and some of the best graphic design in the country. Dig listeners can join 50,000 Jacobin subscribers developing socialist political thought and debate for just $15 a year. $15 gets you an entire year of Jacobin in print and access to the magazine's entire back catalog. If you've never subscribed to Jacobin before, you can access this deal by going to bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/digjacobin, bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin magazine. My name is Daniel Denvir, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Attacking evolutionary biology is critical for the religious rights project of social reaction. Attacking climate science is essential for capitalism's protection of fossil fuel industry profits. Attacking public health science is now essential work in Trump's insane fantasy to make America normal again as workers are forced back to the job and off unemployment. But science is not an inherently progressive enterprise. The way that science is done and utilized has also been essential for American capitalism and empire, from the geologists helping to drill deep water oil wells to the $10 billion Defense Department contract awarded to Microsoft but sought by Amazon, which claims that it was slighted due to Trump's anti-Bezos bias. Poor Jeff Bezos. Science will, we hope, find a coronavirus vaccine. But the political economic conditions within which science in general and vaccine research in particular is done under capitalism means that helpful research that could have been done in the past wasn't, and that if a new vaccine is discovered, it could very well be subject to the demands of profit and nationalism and thus made inaccessible to many who need it. The late radical scientific luminary Richard Levins described the dynamic well. Science, he argued, has a dual nature. He described the concept like so, quote, "On the one hand, it really does enlighten us about our interactions with the rest of the world, producing understanding and guiding our actions. We really have learned a great deal about the circulation of the blood, the geography of species, the folding of proteins, and the folding of continents. We can read the fossil record of 1 billion years ago, reconstruct the animals and climates of the past and the chemical compositions of the galaxies, trace the molecular pathways of neurotransmitters and the odor trails of ants. And we can invent tools that will be useful long after the theories that spawned them have become quaint footnotes in the history of knowledge. On the other hand, as a product of human activity, science reflects the conditions of its production and the viewpoints of its producers or owners. The agenda of science, the recruitment and training of some and the exclusion of others from being scientists, the strategies of research, the physical instruments of investigation, the intellectual framework in which problems are formulated and results interpreted, the criteria for a successful solution to a problem, and the conditions of application of scientific results are all very much a product of the history of the sciences and associated technologies and of the societies that form and own them. The pattern of knowledge and ignorance in science is not dictated by nature, but is structured by interest and belief. We easily impose our own social experiences onto the lives of baboons, our understanding of orderliness in business, implying a hierarchy of controllers and controlled, onto the regulation of ecosystems and nervous systems. Theories, supported by mega libraries of data, often are systematically and dogmatically obfuscating. Levins was a founding member of Science for the People, an organization of radical scientists guided by Marxism, founded in 1969 that put out a magazine of the same name until 1989. Today's episode begins with my shorter interview with Frank Rosenthal, one of the original members of Science for the People in the early 70s. Then, I have a longer discussion with Nafis Hasan, a postdoctoral researcher at Tufts University, working on brain tumors and an organizer with the Boston chapters of DSA and Science for the People. We discuss almost everything I could think about the current politics of science, and it was fascinating. Before we get rolling, this podcast is a listener-supported operation. We also, of course, depend on incredible publishers like Verso and Haymarket, whose ads you hear twice each episode. But the bulk of our funding comes from you, our listeners, who support us at patreon.com/thedig. That is what allows me to do this as a full-time job and to pay all the people who help make this show happen each week. We are also, as you might know, spending a bunch of money right now on an incredible 3-part narrative series on the life and politics of COVID, which you will be hearing soon. And we are also facilitating listeners in organizing Dig book clubs, which you should join if you're interested. This Sunday, we are having our first monthly all book clubs meeting on Zoom with Kim Phillips-Fine to discuss her book, Fear City. You can find out how to join or start a club at thedigradio.com. But anyhow, we can only do all of this because you, our listeners, support us. We also send you a left-wing book or books in the mail if you contribute at least $10 a month. If you are a dedicated listener with a steady source of income who can afford to contribute but you haven't done so yet, take a moment to navigate your web browser to patreon.com/thedig. That's patreon.com/thedig. I also want to let you know how you can subscribe to Science for the People. Each issue of Science for the People is run by a different editorial collective with a different angle on how science and scientists shape politics. For example, the issue Science Under Occupation has stories from Palestine to the Philippines to Kashmir, helping us ask what role has science played in occupation and the struggle against it. How do people develop and adapt science to resist human and environmental exploitation? Their next issues are Fighting for a People's Green New Deal and Biopolitics, and they focus respectively on climate justice and the fight against biological determinism. Science for the People recently dropped their price for a 1-year subscription from $45 a month to $29 a month because they are moving to a PDF-only publication so that they can keep paying contributors through the pandemic. But they're still printing and distributing their next issue, Science Under Occupation. And if you subscribe by May 21st, your subscription will start with a print copy of that issue. Subscribe at magazine.scienceforthepeople.org/subscribe. That's magazine.scienceforthepeople.org/subscribe. One last thing before we get going, I would like to thank Alyssa Battistoni and Simon Torcinta for providing an enormous amount of very helpful help in preparing for this interview. Okay, here's Frank Rosenthal with an interview that is brief, at least in dig time, on the history of Science for the People. Originally trained in experimental physics, Frank Rosenthal spent over 40 years doing research and teaching in environmental and occupational health sciences. He was one of the original members of Science for the People in the early 70s and is active with relaunching the organization today. Frank Rosenthal, welcome to The Dig.
Great to be here, Dan.
In the 1960s and 70s, when Science for the People and a left science movement was emerging, the left was focused on critiquing science for being embedded within these systems of violence and domination, an order that emerged out of World War II, corporate capitalism and the military industrial complex, which at the time were both at the heart of the Vietnam War and mutually assured nuclear destruction, and this broader system of mid 20th century exploitation. But Science for the People was also critical on more fundamental matters of objectivity and expertise. Today, the politics of all that have shifted to some degree. We have what often seems like a left liberal popular front in defense of science against right-wing attacks on climate science, and now with COVID, attacks on public health science too. But before we get into these historical changes, let's start with laying out the politics of science as it was in the era when Science for the People first emerged. Frank, who were the radicalized scientists who founded the group, and what was their critique of the scientific establishment at the time?
So it's hard to underestimate the role of the Vietnam War in all the social movements that were growing at the time that Science for the People originated. The initial movers behind the movement that created Science for the People, it went through a couple of name changes before it became Science for the People, were physics students who were concerned, troubled, outraged about the use of science in the Vietnam War. MIT was a center of this. So the sort of one of the founding events of Science for the People was a moratorium on research at MIT. It was called the March 4th moratorium, where science, mostly grad students, maybe a few faculty, walked out of their labs and said, we are going to stop doing our research to point out this research, not necessarily their own personal research, but that research in general was being used for oppressive purposes. That period was a blossoming of so many different social movements, and the science students were part of that whole social revolution, if as it were. So you had the women's movement, the civil rights movement, which came before, but was then morphing into the Black Power movement. The environmental movement was very big. That was one of my motivations, in addition to the Vietnam War, of becoming an activist. So you had all these different activist movements going on, and at the same time, you had new left thinking that was starting to tie these things together in terms of analysis of society and looking at capitalism as a major force in creating all these problems, and looking at socialism and communism as a solution to the problems.
What, sociologically speaking, accounts for the radicalization of scientists in the 60s and 70s? Is it just a subset of the larger story of New Left radicalization, or was there something particular about the position of scientists, especially young scientists at the time?
I'm not a sociologist, but I guess in sociology, you think of the individual's status or position in the society and how that affects their decisions. Obviously, the science students were exposed to all the same forces that all the other young people were exposed to. They were young people listening to rock music and reading underground newspapers and all this sort of stuff. But I guess one thing about the science students in particular, they tended to be a little bit out of that mainstream. It was always, sort of the campuses, it was the more liberal arts students, philosophy students and stuff who were into the politics. But there was a feeling of alienation of, those of us who were in science. I was in physics, of sort of being in your little science world and not being a part of all those really cool things that were going on in society. So getting involved in politics was one way to connect, I think.
Yeah, certainly. I want to talk more about that, about Science for the People's analysis. And can you explain how this dual nature concretely manifests itself in the world, and how this insight, this notion that science has this dual nature, how that might guide left thinking and action in terms of the politics of science?
Can I connect this before we get to that? Can I connect this up to something uh, that you were asking about previously,
Of
which is
course.
interesting? Interesting to me is, what issues or subjects did Science for the People take up? I said that we originally came into this mostly as physics students and physicists who were protesting war research. But now you're talking about something beyond, way beyond that. You're talking about the ideology of science. You're talking about biodeterminism. So, and the things that Nafis is talking about happened pretty early in the history of Science for the People. So it didn't take very long for the initial impetus of confronting the system over the use of war research to attract or to involve other people involved in other aspects of science, and starting to really introspect on what is science, and how does it work, and why do we find ourselves in this situation where this thing that we love so much that we want to devote our lives to is being used for all these oppressive purposes. So I just thought that was a nice connection between how we started and where we ended up.
As a bi monthly magazine and chapter organization throughout the 70s and 80s, the original Science for the People had a much bigger impact than its numbers might have suggested. Most notably, the organization sustained this decades long polemic against the militarization of American academic life on the one hand, and also these resurgent theories of biological determinism. Can you talk about a bit about how this relatively small political formation was able to exercise so much influence, including influencing a generation of some pretty prominent scientists like Ruth Hubbard, Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin?
We did have an impact in terms of certainly media attention, our activities of Science for the People, particularly our activities at the meetings of the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Uh, these were covered in the pages of Science magazine. Probably the science journal or magazine with the largest circulation in the world. So that's no small thing. So one could fairly say that people in scientific many people in scientific fields knew at least knew that Science for the People existed. In terms of the larger impact in society, I'm not sure how to measure that, but I think one thing to think about it, if we did have an impact, and I think maybe has meaning for today as well, is that the forums where scientific issues are discussed, whether it be in terms of the pandemic that we're facing now, or environmental issues, or renewable energy, those forums where scientists gather and discuss and debate how to apply science to society, that gets a lot of attention in our society. So, and I think that was part of our intention as part of the anti-war movement, that we saw that we had access to a forum that would have a channel of communication with the American people. And of course, there's a class nature to that. Those. forums were not well noticed by, or should I say, they were more noticed by people in the middle class, professional class than other classes. But you got to remember that those people are movers and shakers in society, and so reaching them was, I think, significant.
What were the debates like about how to approach the scientific establishment? I know in the earliest period there was a lot of disruption of events at major science conferences, but maybe then the scientific establishment moved to create a little space for science for the people, which I imagine then prompted all sorts of concerns about being co-opted by the scientific establishment. How did you all navigate that?
I guess there was an issue of an organization like the AAAS. Are they an ally or an adversary? To be honest, we didn't think that much about it. We put them in the adversary camp. Uh, Looking back now, that we could have been a little more nuanced about that. I'm not sure how much it affected our political effectiveness. I think it affected it some. Okay, well, so what adversarial looked like then, and it wasn't only us that was part of the adversary, although I guess we were provoking it by certain things we did, which we felt were necessary. But it looked like going into a session at the AAAS meeting and taking it over and starting to make comments and raise questions from the audience and not stopping. So we would be able to have no business as usual. And we had sessions that we basically reorganized. We didn't really shut them down completely, although some people walked out. But sometimes we would end up just being adamant and persistent in our questions. Not waiting till the official question period, for example. Sometimes we actually took over the podium and then called on the original speakers for their input into a democratized session. Adversary also looks like several of us getting arrested in Washington, D.C. for refusing to part from a literature table they would set up in the hotel lobby. And I was one of 5 or 6 people that were rather crudely apprehended and dragged away to end our impudence at setting up a literature table when it was in violation of some hotel rule or other. It also looked like spelling AAAS as AAA $. Sort of a combination of like it's said sometimes you would have to been there to appreciate it in terms of those times, but it was sort of a combination of humor and guerrilla theater and political struggle and more along serious themes. Definitely a theater aspect to it.
How do you see leftist scientists today, including in the kind of refounded Science for the People, maintaining this sort of independence and militancy, given that the context right now, the dominant politics of science as I think it's conventionally understood, is this sort of liberal versus conservative war between yes science or no science, science versus anti-science. How, given your experience back then, how do you see the left approaching this current dynamic right now?
The thing that's different is the overall political times are different in that we don't have the social movements, the strength of the social movements today that we had back then. I don't think some of our confrontational tactics would work now in the same way that they worked back then.
because then they were an extension of a broader confrontation.
Yeah, they were an extension of a broader social movement that was going on. And our actions, even if they were sometimes crude and not always phrased exactly right, they would resonate with not only with numbers of people, but within social structures, organizational structures. In terms of the scientists, I actually don't see a huge difference. I mean, you had liberal scientists and reactionary scientists then, you have liberal scientists and reactionary scientists now. The issue of anti-science is a little more in the forefront now than it was then, but I don't know how that makes really much of a difference. I mean, if anything, it makes I think it makes a positive difference in terms of organizing among scientists. You know, science for the people. It's always been a question then and now. Who are we organizing? Are we organizing scientists, or are we organizing to make waves in society about science? Obviously, it's both. The organizing of scientists is maybe a little slower, or maybe a lot slower these days because of the lack of those social movements. I mean, in those days, many scientists themselves were caught up in the anti-war movement in a way that scientists, I think, and we're making stereotypes and generalizations, but if I could do that, I would say the default position is to stay out of politics and just do your work and have fun or have success or whatever you have doing it. And of course, to do science well takes a tremendous amount of focus and work, and there's plenty to keep you occupied. Kind of a hard sell in a way to get scientists involved in politics, and it's a little bit of an easier sell these days. Scientists, they see their work threatened. The things that they like to do and give value to their and fulfillment in their life, potentially being taken away from them.
So a follow-up question on this is these sorts of monstrous attacks on these really intense attacks on science that we see from Trump. I get why they politicize scientists, but they might only minimally serve to push scientists into a liberal politics of protecting science against right-wing reaction. What accounts for the new wave of young left-wing scientists who've sort of resurrected science for the people in the last couple years? Because the organization stopped publishing in 1989, and it seems more or less self-evident why any left project was falling apart at that time. But why do you think that Science for the People has reemerged now?
History, a social justice oriented history professor at Amherst, put together a conference on Science for the People, sort of then and now, but mostly then, in terms of looking at the history. And I guess there was a certain chemistry between the older and the professor who organized this made a special point of involving the original members of Science for the People. That's how she actually got interested in the subject through her contacts with some of the original members of Science for the People. Maybe just sort of thinking out loud here is this alienation idea. Back in those days, people were alienated because of the war. Today, maybe science and technical people are alienated because of feeling that they're just kind of cogs in a machine, that they're grinding out new tech applications and helping drug companies market new drugs. And maybe and but it's the same back then. The alienation just takes a different form.
Well, Frank Rosenthal, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dan. Good luck to you in putting this together. And I appreciate your interest in this important aspect of our movement.
Frank Rosenthal spent over 40 years doing research and teaching in environmental and occupational health sciences. He was one of the original members of Science for the People in the early 70s, and today is active in relaunching it. Next up, Nafis Hasan, a postdoctoral researcher at Tufts University working on brain tumors, and an organizer with the Boston chapters of DSA and Science for the People. Nafis Hasan, welcome to The Dig.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start by talking about Science for the People's analysis. One important leader from the original era of Science for the People and an important scholar, Richard Levins, talked about what he called the dual nature of science, which Frank summarized like so recently. Quote, "On the one hand, scientific investigations discover truths about material reality that are independent of ideology or politics. On the other hand, the practice of science is a human endeavor, deeply embedded in the social and political system, which determines what subjects are investigated, why they are investigated, who investigates them, and for what purposes the results are put. Beyond that, in many cases, the dominant ideology of the political system often influences how the results of scientific investigations are framed, conceptualized, and communicated. Because of this, science does not exist as a pure entity that is neutral and objective with respect to public policy." So to start out, explain this dual nature of science, how it concretely manifests itself in the world, and what that has meant both for the left-wing scientists who originally founded Science for the People and those of you who have refounded it today.
Let me start by saying that there's this work we do in the labs, and then obviously the other side is the process of the production of knowledge and also how it's used in society, right? So I think one way to look at it is you uncover some data, and then the interpretation of the data is not value neutral. It's definitely based on your political ideology or your implicit biases or the scientific processes carried out. And I think Richard Levins and Richard Leontief, who wrote the book The Dialectical Biologist, there's a chapter in there called the commoditization of science. And the first line there is the modern science is a product of capitalism. So, and this is, you can see the concrete manifestations of such capitalism's effects on the production of scientific knowledge in like all around you, essentially, because when and a very good example is what drugs are produced, right? So antibiotics is a really good example where because there's a lack of profit motive or antibiotics are not very profitable, there isn't a lot of interest in research for antibiotics or development of new novel antibiotics till you hit like a pandemic like this one. I mean, this pandemic is viral, but I hope it conveys the same idea. Similarly, back in the early 90s, there was a lot of pharmaceutical companies leaving vaccine research because vaccines were just not profitable. And by the time it was like 2002 or 2003, there were only 4 major pharmaceutical companies left in the vaccine world, in the US, in vaccine production, right? So again, the research and development of novel vaccines or even the production of vaccines was entirely dependent on market forces. And this also affected what research was being funded, right? At that time, there was a lot of shifting of federal government funding towards understanding more profitable, quote unquote, profitable diseases, such as chronic diseases like diabetes or heart conditions, which are chronic conditions, but you also need to take medication for it for a long time. And so that is essentially, that would provide a cash crop, if you want to say, for a pharmaceutical company. So that's just like one part of it, right? And then obviously there are other aspects of science, for example, military technology or the military industrial complex and the research associated with it. There's also something I like to call the cancer industrial complex, where similarly with other kinds of drugs, cancer drugs are also sort of produced in a manner which requires the patients to be dependent on them on their life. And of course, cancer it's a very difficult disease. It's actually considered a collection of diseases at this point right now. So I mean, I hope that kind of shows the dual nature of science. And so for left-wing scientists, I think the founders, the Richard Levins, was part of a group called the Sociobiology Study Group, and at that time there was a lot of work around social behavior and biology, right? I mean, that's why E.O. Wilson coined the term sociobiology. Can you explain social human behaviors using biological evidence? And so all of this went into, and a lot of it was basically, biological determinism, where they were trying to use genetics to prove that some communities or some ethnicities were inferior to others, right? And they were bringing in some aspects, like even aspects of phrenology. So Charles Marr's book, The Bell Curve, is essentially a study of the differences in IQ between races, essentially saying, Black people have less IQ, and it's because of their genes. Obviously, Stephen Jay Gould, who was a member of the sociobiology study group at that time, he definitely pushed back with his really good book called The Mismeasure of Man, where he, summarily rebutted Charles Marr's claims and stuff. And so, fast forward to today, when the revitalization of science for the people is happening at a time when there's a large polarization. There's also like a growing anti-vaccine movement. There is science is pretty much right now in the grips of capitalist ideology, and there has been steady neoliberalization of science. Also on the production part, we are also seeing like private universities or like sort of proletarianization of of scientists, and they're being called the biomedical workforce or the scientific workforce, right? And this includes grad students, postdocs, even tenured and faculty who in the past had enjoyed a relatively secure position but are now increasingly facing a precarious future, considering how much the universities are operating in a neoliberal method, right? So grad student unionization efforts and also pushing back against climate denialism or climate change denialism or anti-vaxxer movement. This is the new premise of of science for the people today.
Levins suggests that this dual nature of science, if I read him correctly, suggests that it means that the way that the left should approach science is through an immanent critique, to quote, point out both the external and internal aspects that limit science's ability to reach its stated goals. What does this approach that surfaces science's contradictions in this way allow us to see and to do?
That immanent critique that you referred to, I think there's a really good piece in the first issue of the Revitalized Science for the People magazine that came out last summer. Just a shameless plug. But that sort of
Plug away.
basically differentiates between what is a liberal critique versus what is a radical critique. And so for the job of the left-wing scientist is to provide a radical critique of what's wrong with the current system of production of scientific knowledge, and also how science is being used for nefarious purposes. For example, and of course, like how it differs from the liberal critique. So Helen Zhao, who wrote that piece, shows that the liberal critique considers science or the scientific endeavor to be good to begin with, and anything that was bad was just a glitch, or just like one or two instances, right? For example, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, or even eugenics.
A misapplication of an otherwise fundamentally sound and noble enterprise.
Yes, exactly. However, the radical critique is showing that it's a systemic issue, that the science is not free from the political or socioeconomic conditions, and whoever wields the power also determines what science is being used for. And at the time when the Tuskegee syphilis experiment happened, there was obviously a lot of racial issues that we still see today, but it was a lot more pronounced at that time. And a lot of the study subjects were recruited without informed consent because they were Black and they were mostly undereducated at that time. So it's not just, and a lot of folks were complicit in that. And it didn't even stop in the US, right? So, for example, once the Tuskegee syphilis experiment was ended and everything came out about it, it was just covered and there was so much outrage. However, it just sort of shifted abroad. Like, for example, the US government did do clinical trials abroad without taking informed consent from the residents of those areas. And I think it was either in it was in India. There was some clinical trials, also in Puerto Rico, I believe. So yeah, I mean, when you start stacking up the instances where science was used for quote unquote evil purposes or like purposes of undermining human rights, it just keeps adding up. And then I like that's the issue. Like the radical critique is like this systemic issue will point out the systemic issue, which the liberal critique will try and say that, oh, this is just one example or one bad apple or something like that.
The original Science for the People was certainly cognizant of the dangers of right-wing attacks on science, but a lot of their focus was understandably on the liberal scientific establishment and the way it served a core function within American capitalism and empire, particularly with the Vietnam War and the military industrial complex that was waging that war. But things have sort of changed in recent decades with this incredible kind of liberal conservative partisan polarization around the very kind of basic questions of scientific truth and expertise. It's obviously not new. It goes back to the extremely long-running religious right attacks on the teaching of biological evolution. But then more recently, we've seen it really, really powerfully emerge with the industry-funded attacks on climate science. And now with COVID and the constant misinformation that we're seeing in the subjection of public health expertise to the demands of capitalist profit and Trump's reelection prospects. How did science become a culture war issue pitting liberals versus conservatives? And what has that meant for the sort of left-wing critique and politics of science that Science for the People, both then and now, is advancing?
Yeah, that's a that's a pretty big question because I think given the polarization, it's hard to be vocally critical about the problems within the science or the scientific community and the lack of political orientation there, while also defending, the need for science, like the vaccine. If it comes down to vaccine, or like if you're trying to point out parse very subtle differences between climate change models and stuff, because anything can be weaponized at this point.
Because there's this huge risk of leftists obviously have to defend science against the right, but how do you do that without re-reifying science?
Exactly. And I think in my opinion, I would say, since the 1980s, there's been like a steady like sterilization of politics, like the notion that science is a political can have a political orientation or it's affected by politics has been steadily scrubbed off through neoliberal policies or more and more public-private interests merging together. And if you look at, how the universities themselves have become more and more private or profit oriented, right? So essentially, that has removed any sort of notion of politics, and I think from scientific work. And this is clear when you look at movements like the March for Science, right? When March for Science happened,
This was initially in 2017.
yeah. So I actually worked in organizing for the March for Science Boston in 2017, and it was great because this was suddenly there was a lot of scientists just coming out and saying that this we are being attacked, like our funding is being cut, and it's an attack on our lives, but also there are attacks on our work and what we deem to be verifiable truths, right? Because science, the scientific method is based on peer review where we critique each other's work, right? However, like along with that, there was also within the scientific community, there was this rise of this dissent, like why is politics being brought into it? Because initially when the March for Science happened, it was meant to be, and I know this is an overused word, but it was meant to be intersectional, right? It was not just about scientific work, but it was also about the rights of immigrant scientists, the rights of women scientists. Why aren't there or an equal pay and more visibility, or like, and to recognize the harassment that our non-male colleagues face at the workplace, right? And obviously that became a big issue within the community itself. Like, why are these important, right? Like, why we just want to keep the focus narrow, and why is identity politics coming into this? And the problem with that is that, these are systemic problems. So when you don't have a systemic, when you don't have a critique, a radical critique of the systemic issues, that's when people can question these things, like, oh, is it really necessary to talk about, like how a white male dominated culture of scientific research is, right? And obviously that's being countered, but also at like a more liberal level rather than at a radical level. And then you also see stuff like believe science or I support science. But what does that mean? Like, if you do
Follow
not
the
have,
science, trust science.
yes, exactly. I mean, in the book, Margins of Doubt, Naomi Oreskes show that it's the same data that was being produced that was used by the corporations, the fossil fuel industry, and their allies in the government, to sort of not implement any harsh policies to fight climate change, right? It's the same set of data, right? But there's this understanding. It's again, like, the interpretation of data is what's uh, affected by your political ideology rather than the data itself. So when you just say I support science, you say, yeah, I support data, but then you're not saying which interpretation do you support. And when you have decades of such confusion, it's easy to see why it has become a culture war, and why left wing or radical scientists have to like straddle or like walk on such shaky grounds.
It seems to me that in part it's the very specialization, expert knowledge, and training that scientists require, and perhaps that's just inherently necessary to the enterprise. We can get into that a bit later, but that tied to the liberal reification of science, I think, has something to do with the horrible politics of science that we have today, because the centralization of authoritative knowledge in expert hands will always provoke skepticism. And so we have anti-vaxxers who are now disturbingly and unsurprisingly playing a key role in spreading COVID disinformation, and will certainly be leading a campaign to convince people to not vaccinate if a COVID vaccine is found. They are democratizing science too in their own way, and it's not good.
Yeah.
So is the liberal injunction to simply trust science, believe science, follow science, is the flip side of that the right-wing conspiracy theorizing against science? Are both in a way the result of a general crisis in the relationship between scientific expertise and mass democratic politics?
Yeah, obviously, I think, that's, you're hitting the nail on the head. And when the March for Science, during that time, there was also this other idea. Then there was like I think it's a pack called 314 Action, right? And there was this outpouring of support for scientists to run for political office at that time. But I think the issue is that, for and this is like, obviously a problem with academia in general, is like the concept of the ivory tower, right? So scientists, the image of a scientist is long removed from society, that he's like they are a member existing outside society in their
It's like a
labs.
priesthood.
Yes, almost. Yeah, actually, scientists talk trash about religion all the time, organized religion all the time, but some way or the other, we have ended up there. But yeah, I think like what was key is that science communication is like a very important aspect of it. And the way it's communicated, obviously, it depends on the media that's running it. And for the most part, 90% of science articles in the media are like trash, honestly. Like, it's clickbait articles without any nuance, without any subtleties of understanding. And we can go ahead and say, oh, journalists don't talk to us, but it's also that scientists don't know how to talk to journalists as well. And obviously there's other motives behind it, saying that there are other motives, like a university wants to is looking to patent a discovery. So they would obviously put out like a press release that glorifies some aspects and undermines other aspects, right? And it's only when you go into the literature that you find that, okay, this drug or this discovery may not be as groundbreaking as it was made out to be, right? But those things get lost in the larger conversation. So to go back to your question, I think, with the access of information that you have right now, it's very easy to point out or use the data that's out there to support your arguments, right? So liberals do that, anti-vaxxers do that as well, right? So there was a time when an ethyl mercury-based compound was being used in vaccine production, and that did cause some adverse effects. And a lot of folks do use that study, right? But that particular compound has been out of use in vaccine production for a long time. However, the meme in an academic manner still stayed within society. Like it never went out of people's minds, right? So there's these key aspects of information that stay with people, and they just keep on using it. So in order to fight those things, you need to be able to understand that scientists are part of the society, that scientists also have the responsibility to be able to make science understandable to people. Yeah, so there's actually some good work being done around improving science communication, and there's really great science journalists who are able to parse the subtleties of discoveries and stuff. But there's still a long way to go, and there was a very depressing report in 2018, I think, which showed that increased communication or education is not the issue here, because people's beliefs are.
No, anti-vaxxers tend to be well-educated, affluent white people.
That is true, but their base is also a lot of the times poor white people as well, or in some poor people as well, because there's also a political aspect to it, right? As far as I remember, in Pakistan, the CIA had an operation of giving out free polio, but that was a military operation as well, right?
They used it to hunt down bin Laden, and now people don't, and now there's been a backlash against vaccination program in Pakistan.
Exactly. And, polio has not still been eradicated in that area. I mean, and if you understand how basically pathogen evolution works, that means if there's a vaccine or a treatment, and if there in the concurrent time there's also exists the bug is still there, then the chances that resistant polio strains are going to come out are pretty high. Actually, I think in Botswana there's been cases of polio which are resistant to this vaccine. So yeah, I mean, also the antibiotics resistance stuff is also pretty crazy. So it's not looking good out there, because we really kind of fucked it up.
What's the right way to democratize science so that we can effectively fight anti-vaxxers? Because it seems like a lot of the medical establishment and public health establishment is trying to win the vaccine war by doubling down on the very cult of expertise. I'm not talking on anyone in particular. This is just my general impression.
Mm-hmm.
The very cult of expertise that facilitates the anti-vaxxer movement's reaction in the first place. What's a different model?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think personally, I feel that, again, like I was saying, that scientists, this whole cult of expertise, right? Whenever you see an expert, that immediately removes you from the general population. And the more you are going to antagonize anti-vaxxers or paint them as idiots or stupid people or people out to kill us, I don't think that's going to really achieve anything. But that's the knee-jerk liberal reaction, right? A lot of people just imagine why are these people not taking vaccines? It should be easy as daylight. But I was saying is that beliefs about vaccination or evolution and stuff, these are very deeply rooted beliefs, right? And I think those are also tied together to with the believers' material conditions. And I think that's where really it should be dealt with. And I think it also has to do with re-education. It just can't be applied separately. It has to be a complete overhaul. Why the people wouldn't trust a government vaccination program has less to do with the effectiveness of the vaccine and more to do with why people don't trust the government. I think that would be my answer at the time, because it's less of a problem of showing people data, but more of a problem of how do you convince people that this is not actively harming them, as so many other policies have done before.
Listeners might be familiar with the problem of representing expertise in a certain way from the Twitter phenomenon of people, of historians establishing their authority in tweets by beginning their tweets with the words "historian" here. I don't know if you've seen that.
I don't, but I think I've seen that similar things in climate Twitter.
Yeah, fill in the blank here as a way to establish authority in the Twitterverse and immediately repulse the very people you're trying to convince.
Exactly.
Um,
And yeah,
Levin's had a really interesting, I've only read a little bit of his work, but he had a really interesting analysis of this very sort of alternative new age anti-science as individualist. And I found it really resonant. He wrote, quote, "They too have class roots that lead some of them to separate individual from social causation. For instance, criticizing the magic bullets of the pharmaceutical industry, but peddling their own miraculous natural cures. Or promoting holistic cancer treatments, but ignoring the industrial origins of many cancers. The alternative communities are domains where insightful and radical critique mixes with petty and medium scale entrepreneurship." He has another really smart analysis of the conservative anti-science framework. He writes, quote, "Conservative critics reject the fragmented and reductionist aspects of modern science on behalf of a holistic, organic view of the world. At an aesthetic and emotional level, their holism partly resonates with that of radical criticism, but their holism is hierarchical and static, stressing harmony, balance, law and order, the ontological rightness of the way things are, were, or are imagined to have been." He continues, quote, "Although its opposition to liberalism is opposition to the liberating aspects of that doctrine, the reactionary attack on liberalism often emphasizes the oppressive or ineffectual sides of liberalism." How do you see we've been talking about the relationship between the kind of liberal or scientific establishment and the anti-vaxxer movement? How do you see more generally the relationship between the liberal scientific establishment and conservative anti-science that Levin's analyzes here?
I have to give it to Levins. That man was so ahead of his times, but
Yeah.
also like he definitely read his history as well. I think that, the holistic part, right? It is kind of strange that conservatives are more or were focused on the holistic aspects and rejected the reductionist aspect, because the reductionist aspect of science was peddled as like the quote unquote progressive science, that this was it. And I think that was a reactionary thing from the conservatives, saying that I'm not going to buy this magic bullet thing and I'm going to move towards my holistic medicine. Science as we understand it, like Western science has really at some point, rejected or like wholesale made fun of indigenous knowledge or other holistic practices that were not coming out of the Western world, and which is really ironic because the treatment for malaria was definitely generated from indigenous knowledge, from the bark of the tree, and to give quinine. Even artemisinin, which was the next generation of malaria drug, was also from a tree and also from indigenous knowledge. And even smallpox vaccination, Edward Jenner, yeah, he definitely did really good work in doing a scientific study of smallpox vaccination. But before that, there was the idea of variolation that was derived from indigenous knowledge. So I think, there's something to be said about the holistic knowledge that was rejected by Western science at some point. And so therefore there was like a sort of like a reactionary mechanism in conservatives to sort of adopt something that quote unquote progressives had adopted. But also Christopher Caldwell, who's like the British Marxist, had such a big insight on this. It's that it's the bourgeois philosophy that led the formation of a reductionist science and on the liberal science, which is what we see today. And so again, conservatives in politically conservative people believe that liberals are trying to brainwash them into doing things or trying to take over. So it is a reactionary mechanism for them to deal with it, and that's why they peddle what are pseudoscientific quote unquote truths, that you should be able to do holistic things. And in reaction to that, I mean, if you said this is sort of like dialectical in a way, liberals reject the conservative approach because they think that this is not grounded in facts and evidence and what they hold to be true. So there's no point in taking that in, which is interesting because palliative care definitely, or even a holistic understanding of a chronic or systemic disease, for example cancer, can go a long way. It improves the quality of life. In fact, when you think about how cancer treatments are done, majority of the cancer treatments, or at least like the first generation of cancer treatments, are all derived from weapons used in World War I and II. So did not really make for great quality of life for the patients. In fact, a lot of them were basically, if it didn't kill you, you barely survived it, right? So if cancer didn't kill you, the treatment would. If the treatment didn't, then you are a survivor. So more recently, there's like understanding that palliative care is about increasing the quality of life of the patient rather than just trying to cure the disease. And this is sort of coming full circle to understanding that an organism, you just cannot break it down into parts or remove it from the environment.
This is Sarah Jaffe, and you are listening to The Dig with Daniel Denvir, my favorite podcast for thoughtful discussions on the U.S. left and beyond, and you can support it on patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The Dispossessed, a story of asylum at the U.S.-Mexican border and beyond, by John Washington. The Dispossessed tells the story of a 24-year-old Salvadoran man, Arnovis, whose family's search for safety shows how the United States, in concert with other Western nations, has gutted asylum protections for the world's most vulnerable. Crisscrossing the border and Central America, John Washington traces one man's quest for asylum. Journalist and author Jeremy Scahill says of The Dispossessed, quote, offering expansive historical analysis of how ancient religions, cultures, and societies understood the imperative of welcoming the outsider, particularly those seeking safety from harm or death, and contrasting it with our current world order. Washington has written one of the most important books of our time on one of the most dire systematic injustices on our planet. The Dispossessed, a story of asylum at the U.S.-Mexican border and beyond, by John Washington. Out now from Verso Books. In terms of that question of the harm that reductionism does, I want to ask about to what degree is science currently and throughout recent history failing to explore and explain the broader ecological context of zoonotic infectious disease emergence, the emergence of infectious diseases like COVID-19, because there's all sorts of analysis that many of us on the left have read about in terms of the encroachment on forest lands and industrial agriculture, and we see nothing about that in the mainstream press that I've seen, beyond some discussions of pangolins or, China shutting down wet markets. But Levins, in an article that I think might have been from 2000, an article entitled, "Is Capitalism a Disease?" He wrote about how science had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of infectious disease, and that by the 1970s, that many scientists had believed that medical advances had tamed infectious disease and that the task of medicine would then be to just treat chronic illness and illnesses related to aging. And of course, we now know in the most painful way possible that did not turn out to be true. And he wrote, quote, "So what was wrong with our epidemiological assumptions? We need to recognize the historical mindset in medicine and related sciences was dangerously and ideologically limited. Nearly all who engaged in public health prediction took too narrow a view, both geographically and temporally. Typically, they looked only at a century or two instead of the whole sweep of human history. Had they looked at a wider time frame, they would have recognized that diseases come and go when there are major changes in social relations, population, the kinds of food we eat, and land use. When we change our relations with nature, we also change epidemiology and the opportunities for infection. It's a brilliant article that I recommend people read and feels very relevant around, I think, 20 years after he wrote it. But let me repose Levin's question to you. What has been and continues to be wrong with prevailing epidemiological assumptions?
So I think part of what Levins has said still holds true. I think in the last couple of decades since he wrote the essay, which is, I totally second that motion. You should definitely read it for the listeners. So we have come to the understanding that yes, there is other determinants of health. For example, socioeconomic status is a big one that has been incorporated in the epidemiology. But I feel like we're still missing the point where we're not realizing that within a system how everything is connected. And James Lovelock had and Lynn Margulis had proposed a hypothesis called the Gaia hypothesis, where the world itself is a big organism and everything is interconnected, right? And I mean, there's obviously good critiques of that sort of idea, but I think I just want to stress on the idea of interconnectedness, because when you read Levins, right, like what he's saying is that he's stressing on the idea of co-evolution. And this goes back to the idea of dialectical biology, what he and Leontine wrote in their book, is that it's the organism and the environment co-determine each other. Like they act upon each other and they evolve together, right? So ultimately, the current understanding of evolution is still one-sided. It's either the organism is acting on the environment or the environment is acting on the organism. So whenever we are studying these zoonotic transmissions or disease pathologies or how they arise, we're still not taking the whole picture into account. We're still studying only one side, whether it's the agent or the affected, right? So, this is the problem, is that a lot of the times we do not see the connection between human behavior and the consequences that are arising from the environment for that. I mean, the whole wet market thing is definitely like a very Orientalist, xenophobic idea, because actually it's being questioned whether or not it actually came from a bat, right? So,
And initially, there was widespread and total misinformation because, Chinese people ate bats. That was like the
yeah,
initial kind of racist stereotype explanation.
yeah. I mean, it's really odd to me that people's dietary choices were made the first thing to blame at that point, considering how there's other esoteric things you eat in the United States as well. I mean,
Odd but unsurprising from an anthropological perspective, because you are what you eat is kind of true on a cultural
right,
interpretation
right.
level. People have strong associations between food and identity and strange food as marking kind of dangerous others.
That is definitely true. Anyway, so to go back to sorry for that,
No,
diversion
no,
there,
no.
but like the point I was trying to make is that I think Rob Wallace has a really good article in the Monthly Review showing how the encroachment, and it's one of the leftist articles you mentioned, is that that you're referring to, is that how the encroachment of land through agribusiness is basically pushing the boundaries between where humans reside versus where the environment starts, right? So the boundaries are pretty much blended at this point. And also, Kim Moody has an article in Spectre Journal where he talks about how the virus traveled through what he calls because of just-in-time capitalism, right? So you have these huge global supply chain network throughout the world where agricultural business or forestry business or logging, these are all sort of interconnected. And when you look at the transmission data of COVID, you can see like a lot of these are people who are doing a lot of the transportation work, right? Like, so even within cities, you see subway workers or like bus drivers being affected at a lot higher rate, the postal workers, and then also long distance truckers are being infected at a higher rate. And this is, again, going back to the whole idea of like interconnectedness at a human level. And when you look at the organism environment level, you're seeing the coevolution. And a good example of that, which Levins also refers to in that article, is that the mosquito Aedes aegypti which is responsible for carrying the dengue, which is the vector for dengue fever, grows in stagnant water, right? So when you are building dams, or when there's a lot of urban development, or even as recently showed, and this is in Bangladesh, actually, where I'm from, and my brother has done some work on this, is that you see the window for the dengue fever is actually steadily increasing because of climate change, right? And I don't, I mean, unless you're like a climate change denier, there's no doubt that human activity is causing climate crisis at this point. And as we're accelerating more towards that, these diseases are just like going to, the window of the endemics are going to increase, as we're already seeing in Bangladesh for dengue fever. And also, sometimes it really scares me that what is under the permafrost, right? Like there's old viruses lying under the permafrost, which would melt and be unleashed on the world. And considering how the COVID-19 pandemic is being dealt with, that is a very scary prospect.
I think something else that's exemplary of the harm that and the distortion caused by this reductionist, anti-systemic sort of scientific perspective that we've been discussing is that liberals understand that the virus has had disproportionately negative impacts on poor people, particularly racialized poor people in the United States and globally. But it seems to me that the left insight is somewhat distinct, and it's to see these systemic inequalities and the gutted public health care system and the just-in-time production, all of these things, the entirety of the socio-ecological system as, in fact, fundamentally constitutive of the pandemic. Like there's no pandemic independent of these things. It's not a merely narrowly microbiological phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, there wouldn't have been a pandemic if it wasn't due to the failures of the neoliberal governments to sort of contain the virus. It is, again, I get to repeat that very cliche phrase, we live in a society. It is never really just the biological agent that is at fault here, because, the crisis of the pandemic, or the proportions it took, is due to lack of ventilators, due to lack of personal protective equipment, right? And due to lack of people's healthcare. Even as the US government is sort of trying to get more PPE, more ventilators, and some states have secured those, the problem is that in the indigenous reservations, there's been close to zero federal help like going in there, right? And they're already underfunded, right? And so if it hits those areas, then those people are definitely at so much higher risk than the rest of us who may have better access to medical treatment and such like that. A more local example is that Chelsea, which is a town in Massachusetts, very close to Boston, is the hardest hit town in Massachusetts. And historically, Chelsea has borne the brunt of environmental injustice, like air pollution problems, high asthma rates in that area. It's an immigrant working class community. So you can't just ignore those socioeconomic determinants of health, because if those towns or reservations or communities had the resources to deal with it, then the disease wouldn't have taken on such proportions.
I think this brings us to the question of to what extent this is a problem of the uses to which science is put, to what extent it's a more fundamental problem about how science is done, or whether it's both, and whether in fact those two things are somehow interrelated.
I think this is definitely interrelated. I guess it's hard for me to parse the use of scientific knowledge and also the production of scientific knowledge at this point, because when you see what research is being funded comparatively to others, and a really good example is that, environmental causes of cancer, that particular area gets a lot less financial resources allocated to it compared to other causes. For example, there's some debate in the field of what actually causes cancer, but let's say for now, the genetic causes of cancer, right? So when you look at that, one of them, the environmental causes, is a more holistic approach to understanding how cancer can arise, right? Um, and whereas when you look at the genetic cause of cancer, that is entirely, it is a reductionist view, but it also sort of puts the onus on the individual. And a couple of years ago, there was like it's a very controversial paper called the bad luck paper in the cancer field. Essentially, it was saying that some people are predisposed to getting cancer because of their genetic makeup, and it's just their bad luck at that point. So that's there. And the other thing is like science being put to use again, like I said, data is data. How you interpret it or how you use it, or for whatever gains, entirely depends on your like political and social factors here. For example, I'm sure you might be familiar with 23andMe, right? So the genetic sequencing company. So when they started giving out tests, and this was very interesting to see because their test does not gives you a probability of how closely you might be related to some reference DNA that they have of certain populations, right? It's an approximation at best, right? But people were using that to claim identities, and it was really odd because the right wing.
Some people like certain left liberal candidates for president.
Yes, yeah. I mean, but like the other part was that right wing people were definitely using such data to promote eugenics, like our more modern version of eugenicist ideas. And one of the oddest, or like actually it was a little funny because they were doing this like gallon milk challenge because they were lactose tolerant, and they believed that made them the superior race, which is, I don't know, like you can make whatever you want of that. But yeah,
Of all the hooks to try to hang white
yeah.
supremacy on the capability to chug milk, which first of all is a child's pursuit. No offense to any listeners out there who are adults that drink full glasses of milk, but I mean, come on.
I mean, I drink milk every day, so
Okay, so no offense to you, but many of us, put that habit away after our childhood. Just saying. I'm not
Right.
calling you a white supremacist.
Yeah, and also there's like bigger questions of, why is there so much money going to developing such expensive weaponry, like where that could be funded for more social programs, right? Obviously, that's another big question. Like, why is there funding towards, the Department of Defense does fund a lot of variety of projects, and some of them have given rise to more public use. Like, for example, the internet was essentially funded back in the day by the DoD. But obviously the question still arises, like, what is the purpose and who is guiding it, right? Again, this is going back to the dual nature of science, like what Levins wrote is like, it's not just the production of knowledge, but like who has control over the production of knowledge, right? And what sort of political ideology is guiding that production of knowledge. And that determines a lot of outcomes of or use of scientific knowledge at this point.
Science for the People activists in the early 70s, in this article that was rejected by Science magazine over the recommendations of reviewers and was a bit of a scandal at the time, they wrote, quote, "It is no accident that two of the most advanced monopolistic formations, advanced both in their utilization and support of science and in the efficiency and sophistication of their internal organization, are Bell Telephone and IBM. They represent to capitalist planners the wave of the future, the integration of scientific knowledge, management technique, and capital, which guarantees the long-run viability of the capitalist order. They also represent industries which are key to the servicing and rationalizing of the basic industries, as well as to the maintenance of the international domination of U.S. capital." Today, is it similarly no accident that we see Amazon, Google, and Apple in this incredibly dominant position, and in a dominant position in also familiar ways? Google chairman Eric Schmidt now sits on 2 advisory committees advising the Department of Defense. How does your analysis of the role of science within present-day American capitalist political economy compare to that advanced by Science for the People's original cohort? Is it formally basically the same? Is it just kind of the content that has changed, or is the content not really substantively changed either?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much remained the same because from the 70s to now we have actually seen much more entrenchment of capital and scientists sort of falling in line with it. Because, like I said, the steady neoliberalization of scientific research has brought us here today, right? So there's not a lot of dissent among the ranks, and in particular, at least in the biomedical sciences, besides the obvious targets of eugenics, there's really not been much outcry against what is taking place or how the science is being used. Because biomedical research has always been well funded, and a lot of researchers have personally profited from it. I'm just going to keep this short, but the case of Carlo Crocci, who's a professor out in Ohio, who basically is a cancer researcher, but has used a lot of the grant money for his own private interests and stuff. New York Times did a really good expose on him. But also I feel like while top level Google, Amazon employees or the executives have sided with the status quo, I think it sort of falls onto the quote unquote rank and file workers, either in tech or in scientific research, because you also see the same thing in grad student organizing, to push back against such marriages between the leaders of the scientific enterprise or the tech enterprise and then the political leaders.
In terms of concretely what left science looks like, Levins and his radical science colleague, Richard Lewontin, made an argument for what they called dialectical biology, which argued that biology itself had to be reimagined through Marxist dialectics. To what extent is Marxism a way to understand science and how its findings are deployed within an unequal and fundamentally politicized world? And to what extent can Marxism more fundamentally change how science is done? And in terms of what Marxist science might look like, how does the sort of dialectical biology that Levins and Lewontin argue for, how does that differ from what we saw in the Soviet Union, where dogma was applied in a really crude way to evolutionary biology, creating this just absurdly unscientific theory of Lysenkoism?
Like I said before, Levins was a very foresight, a man with a lot of foresight, right? And I think what Levins and Lewontin advocated, the dialectical biology, and Marxism can help on both the natures of science that he describes in Dual Nature of Science. One is the theoretical aspect, and the other one is the practical one, right? So the theoretical aspect is something that's not only just Marxist, but also naturalists, independently of the Marxists, have also come to the same conclusions. So when Engels wrote the Dialectics of Nature, he laid down 3 laws, and without going too much into them, what the 3 laws were saying is that one is that nature cannot be, is anti, the law of against reductionism, how the environment and the organism act upon each other, and thirdly is how they evolve together, so the theory of change, right? And this is the biological interpretation, or Levins and Lewontin's interpretation of Engels's dialectical laws, right? The interesting part is that Ernst Mayr, who is a evolutionary biologist and a theorist, he was asked once, are you a Marxist? And he said, no, I don't identify as a Marxist. And then he wrote this essay called The Roots of Dialectical Materialism in the 70s, saying how naturalists themselves have come to the same conclusion over years of studying the environment, is that the environment, the organism and the environment interact together and change together, and the environment cannot be reduced to a single part, right? Because it removes all sorts of emergent properties from the evolutionary aspect, from the physiological aspect, and these are all detailed in the dialectical biology book that Levins and Lewontin write. So that was very interesting because, John Bellamy Foster has a really good book called Marxist Ecology. And for a long time, he argues that Western Marxists did not take into account Marx's ecological writings because they did not see a value for dialectics of nature by Engels, right? However, when you go back to what Marx actually worked on, he had a thesis on a Greek philosopher called Epicurus, and Epicurus had a particular materialism that he advocated. So Epicurean materialism includes chance as an ontological agent. And this is very key to understanding what went wrong in the Soviet Union's Soviet science, and also why Marxism is still applicable for modern day biology. And let me say a little bit about Soviet science before I move to like more modern day biology, which is proving that, like the cliche that Marx is right, right? So, um,
It's definitely a cliche on this podcast. Continue.
all right, good. So for the 100th time, Marx is right. Um, yeah. So,
Surprise.
yeah. So in the Soviet Union, what happened was Lysenko, who was an agricultural agrarian, right? And he had this idea that the environment was the main agent of change, of heredity. And so if you could change if you could put an organism in an environment and you change the environment, that will result in the desired change in the organism itself. I think one experiment he tried to do was grow seeds over time in frozen soil so that the seeds would just be able to survive the winter. And of course, this is not going to work because that's not how it works. Even in dialectics, this is a rejection of dialectics, because in dialectics you have the organism and the environment co-determine each other. They interact on each other. So neither of them are the passive agent. They're both active agents working on each other. And this was the problem. The dogmatic Marxism in Soviet science was entirely based on a mechanistic interpretation of materialism, rather than which excluded chance as an ontological agent, and also the idea that both the organism and the environment interact, co-determine each other. And that was the main problem. And moving forward, this was, Lysenkoism and its failures has been propped up against Marxist biology for like a long time now, and it sort of kind of destroyed the tradition that was organismal biological tradition that was growing out of Marxist biology at that time. There were Western Marxists like scientists like J.D. Bernal and J.B.S. Haldane, who were very vocal about the role of Marxism in describing biology. Even Joseph Needham, right? So Joseph Needham was actually a Christian scientist. And he believed that Marxism, besides being the correct method for studying science, could also affect the rest of your life, except religion. So he didn't really, give out much space on that.
One caveat.
Yeah, just one caveat. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that, and that sort of killed it, right? And after Lysenkoism was shot down, there was other political aspects that came in, and changes in understanding of biology, and the focus slowly shifted to genetics. And then once the molecular revolution happened, which is when Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA, everything just turned to molecular biology, right? And then a lot of the work that even pre-Soviet science developmental biologists in Germany had done, or even continuing through this tradition of like an organismal biology, which supported Marxism or Marxist ideas like, Ernst Mayr shows, those kind of got slowly lost. And added to that was the steady entrenchment of bourgeois philosophy in both academic research and also the scientific knowledge of the production of scientific knowledge. And I think this is the other part, right? So there is no praxis without theory, and vice versa. So one thing is that oftentimes, like, there is a class analysis that is missing from scientists or the work that they do, right? So earlier I had talked about, or I had talked a little bit about proletarianization of the scientists themselves, right? So now they're a workforce. So when you become workers, you need to have an analysis of how your labor is being used or expropriated by capitalist interest, right? So when you work in a university setting, or if you work in biotech as a worker, you're the one who's getting squeezed, right? Grad students, that's why grad students are unionizing. Tenured faculty are also trying to unionize. For example, in my alma mater, Tufts University, tenured faculty did try to unionize because the university was trying to cut faculty salaries, while there's been an administrative bloat in universities, which is like a pretty common trend as far as I understand. So what I'm trying to say is that this Marxist analysis is necessary for the theoretical aspect of understanding how biology actually works, going back to the whole idea of like interconnectedness. And on the other hand, the practice of science needs to be rooted in a class analysis, because it needs to be understood like who the science is meant for, and two, how you're working on it, and three, who has control over it, right? Who has control over the production process? Is it, if the money is coming from taxpayers through a government agency, then it should be the everyday taxpayer who should be in control of the production process, right? I mean, that's like something I suppose not very well talked about in academia, because there's the lack of the class analysis. And I think part of it is because, again, like I said, like scientists do tend to be removed a little bit from society in general, but they're still living. It's like living separate lives. Like in the lab, you're one, and when you exit the lab, you're part of another reality. Yeah. So when you look at both of these aspects, again, Marxism sort of ties the two together, that you need to have the theoretical aspect as well as the practical aspect of doing science. And specifically in terms of biology, I did want to mention the more modern biology is there's this idea of what is called a holobiont. So the developmental biologist Scott Gilbert, he works out of Swarthmore, and he proposed this idea that a human body is not just human cells. A human body also contains bacteria inside and outside, right? So you have the bacteria in your gut, you have bacteria in your skin, and actually the number of bacterial cells in your body outnumbers your own cells, right? So, and these bacterial populations are inherited from your parents. They're changed by where you live, what you eat, right? So it's a dynamic environment. Like you are like an organism is a walking ecosystem. So the best way to describe this organism is by calling it a holobiont. And it's a fascinating idea because it kind of shows like how much you're embedded in the environment rather than being isolated from the environment. What reductionist biology says is that organisms can be studied in isolation, and causality can be constructed from low level to high level just by studying particular molecules to particular cells to particular tissues, right? So, and without taking into account the whole picture.
Is it fair to say that this marginalization of Marxist science in particular, and just more systematic science, more ecological science in general, that has really helped the consolidation of the reductionist science that we know as establishment science, particularly genetic reductionism?
Yeah, definitely. A big thing was the Human Genome Project, right? So once the human genome was sequenced, and so many things were promised, and that happened in 2001. And 19 years later, we have learned a lot about DNA, but we still haven't quote unquote, cured cancer, right? We still haven't cured diabetes, heart diseases. Yes, we have developed better drugs for them, but none of the promises that were made at the onset of Human Genome Project, we are there. So the sidelining of Marxism, the thing is, like, it's not just like at the level of just of the theory, but it's also the practice of it, right? So again, like I said, it's like the new liberalization of the process that resulted, that is in concordance with a reductionist philosophy, right? So these two things actually go together. So like a holistic or like an organismic view of biology is not compatible with the neoliberal program and what Christopher Caldwell says, the bourgeois philosophy, right? So you see it in society, and you also see it within the theoretical aspects of biology as well. So yeah, it's the genetic reductionism is definitely a product of the sidelining of Marxism, and not just Marxism, because like I said, the biologists also had an independent strain of thought that agreed with Marx or Engels' dialectics of nature, but like that overall holistic view.
So we tend to kind of counterpose reactionary politics and liberalism, but does what you're saying mean that neoliberalism then is also complicit in these recurrent efforts to establish race as a biological category, and to use those categories to explain differences and create hierarchies between, or legitimate hierarchies between so-called races?
Oh yeah, definitely. There's no doubt about that, because I guess like what I'm trying to say is that the center of a new liberalism, as far as I understand, and it is the individual, right? And everywhere you see, it's like it's the individual is essentially determined by its genetics, and so there's like so much genocentrism. Like I said, like the popularity of 23andMe, it shows something, right? Like people want to know who they are, and for a long time they've been told that DNA is our blueprint, DNA is the code, and you are who your DNA says it is. Yeah, sure. Some people will admit that, yeah, environment affects your growth and blah, blah, blah. And so the whole debate over nature versus nurture still goes on, is because of neoliberalization and of the neoliberalism, because that still cannot comprehend that nature and nurture can exist together. It has to be like nature versus nurture.
So we've seen how the politics of science this analysis allows us to sort of connect the dots between gene-centric view in the academy and white nationalists chugging milk on YouTube or wherever they do it. But the politics of science obviously shapes gender politics too, with gender critical TERFs who have embraced biology as determinant of womanhood. And then we have incels who are obsessed with jawlines as determinative of which men get to have tons of sex and which get to have no sex at all. Why is the right, which we've discussed earlier in this interview as this force that's attacking science, attacking climate science, spreading, COVID misinformation, why is the right always reaching for biological determinism? And what does that say about this question we've been discussing about the problems with reifying science?
Wow, yeah, that's a big question. I think, it's because biology is meant to provide an answer for human nature. And I think the right is very determined to prove that they're very determined to prove by any manner that they're innately better than the rest of us, right? So like the mainstream ideas of biology appeal to them because they see there a way to like an unchangeable evidence that yes, we have these genetic markers, we have these jaw lines or like physiological parameters that makes us better. And obviously evolutionary psychology played a huge role in shaping such ideas, which is like evolutionary psychology did a lot of damage to society, to be honest. But also, you see the remnants of that trying to find answers to complex behavioral questions within the genetic makeup, right? So there was the quest for the gay gene at some point, for example. As far as gender goes, it's interesting because the way this is where also science communication, like I really feel like science media, the way the media portrays science has just done again a lot of damage without really parsing the subtleties. Is that the whole concept of like estrogen being the women's hormone and testosterone being the male hormone did do like they create these binaries, and binaries are easy to grasp and use, whereas subtleties take a lot more. Like, I mean, I guess like what I'm trying to say is that there's not a lot of room for nuance in the arguments that take place in social media or in the larger mainstream media, right? So, and it's weird because you have estrogen in men and testosterone in women too. So like there's really no reason why one should be called the male hormone and the other female hormone. That's really not the point here. And gender, and I think this is part of it, is that gender and sex are different. And I think there's a lot more well-versed people than me to talk about this, but just want to point out that just your chromosomal makeup shouldn't determine your gender, which is a social category. And also race is also like a social category. It's not a biological category. The biological differences you see between race shouldn't mean that they should be treated differently, and in most cases differently means inferior, at least in like this white supremacist culture. But that you should be able to understand the differences and provide, or like sort of treat them like according to their needs, right? For example, Black women are more susceptible to getting a more aggressive form of breast cancer compared to white women, right? So this is a biological difference between the two races. But that doesn't mean that Black women should be without treatment, which is the case. A lot of the times, Black women receive a lot less treatment or for breast cancer, even within the same income group. So it's not necessarily just about class; it's also about race, right? So,
but it also doesn't mean that biological race is real, because that's not an attribute of blackness. I don't specifically know about the breast cancer
right.
case, but in terms of, say, sickle cell anemia, which is associated with Black people, associating it with Black people as a product of blackness, which is not a biological category but a social category, also obscures the fact that people from various parts of the Middle East and the Mediterranean also have a predisposition to sickle cell anemia.
Right. No, that's exactly it. Like it shouldn't mean that. And also the reason is, when you are a Black person in the US, your environment is very different from the environment of a white person. And I think Levin sort of touches it on his article that you mentioned, is that again, but like is that socioeconomic status, or they leave mark on your physiology. So your entire history, right? Your entire upbringing, your physiology is shaped not just by your biology, but also your environment and your class status, your the whole list of variables that are not biological, right? So biology just isn't simply biology, or it's not reductionist because it's tied in with your environment, which is determined by politics and society. So yeah, I mean, these social categories that are superimposed on biological evidence is a sort of weaponization of like facts or like data, right? And the right is very much, even though they are anti-vaxxers, even though they spread misinformation for COVID for their political gains, they are using same scientific evidence or data, using their political ideology to make political and social gains. So this is, again, sort of like going full circle into like the relation between on the dual nature of science, right? And liberal versus radical critiques of science and all of that.
How do you think about the questions around technology's role in society and political economy? Because that's a major subject of debate within the left, including when it comes to climate with the issue of geoengineering. On the one hand, I think that geoengineering is rightfully critiqued as a techno fix that could function to dodge the core question with climate, which is eliminating fossil fuel, stop burning fossil fuels. And you could argue that in many ways that's already the ideological function that geoengineering performs now, is to obscure the fundamentals of the debate. But on the other hand, even if we abolished burning fossil fuels and capitalism tomorrow, which doesn't seem so likely, unfortunately. But even if we did, it seems to me that we could benefit from a publicly owned carbon sucker if such a thing were possible, because there's just too much. There's already too much carbon in the atmosphere, and global warming is happening right now. So my question is, what do you make of this debate? And can we have a critique of Silicon Valley techno fixes, the politics and economics of those, while also recognizing the liberatory potential of technology? Because after all, a vaccine is in a sense a techno fix too, if we accept this kind of systemic ecological, political, economic framework for analyzing disease emergence.
First of all, I want to say that Science for the People has has an issue dedicated to geoengineering that is really very informative. And what I'm about to tell you is like, a lot better detailed there by other experts, quote unquote experts. I think, Dan, actually, you sort of brought, like in your question, I want to highlight a couple of things. One is publicly owned carbon sucker, right? And I think the key there is the publicly owned, right? Majority of the geoengineering projects, such as solar radiation management or carbon capture and sequestration, are currently done by private interests, right? And so then the question always becomes, who is this technology for? Who is it going to benefit, right? You can't, and this is like a big deal in the climate movement itself, like when we are pushing for renewables, with the understanding that these boost in renewable production, solar panels or windmills, they require these minerals that need to be mined from the global south, right? So again, is this mining happening in a way that like with solidarity with the labor that's working in the mines, with with respect to the ecological damage it's causing, right? Like, are we doing this with cognizance of that? And then what are the reparations, right? And what is this technology going to be made free for the global south, right? Because of centuries of colonialism that the global north has done to extract resources from the global south, right? So it's not necessarily just a question of like, do we need this or not? It's about like, yes, I personally am tech agnostic. I think to some extent we need to be able to use all the options we have, but we have to keep in mind that there are planetary limits. And I think this is like a big rift in the climate left, is that a certain sect believes that there shouldn't be any planetary limits. Like we should just be able to mine asteroids. I mean, sure, yeah, that sounds like a pretty great idea, but are you going to let Tesla do it, or are you going to do like a centrally planned economy throughout the world which can do it by itself. And I mean, if you have read King Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, then you know that the corporations are definitely going to try that first, and they have the resources to do that. But also, I think, recognizing planetary limits is not necessarily, and this is where it really bothers me, because we, not we, but like that aspect of what is known as degrowth movement, right? So degrowthers, and there's definitely the extreme part of degrowth, which is more anarcho-primitivist, where like, okay, let's just go back to the lands, live in small communities, and blah blah blah. And that has some eco-fascist overtones. But also, like, what would it mean to live within the planetary limits, right? How do we reimagine a world where you can still live and not have to, call for population control, or like not call for population control at all, because the effects are, obviously going to fall on non-white communities, which historically has been the case, and still be able to avert the climate crisis, right? And I think there's a lot of fixes within not just techno, but like also the whole question of like, what are we producing, who are we producing these for, and is this really necessary, like how the economy is centered, right? And then the concepts of like what technology is being used, like instead of, there's technology out there, like for example, high-speed rail could easily replace car culture, which would like cut a lot of the emissions, right? So it's not just like talking about, oh, we just got to build this new technological carbon capture project, right? I mean, obviously, you can talk about rewilding the earth, right? So plant more trees, which are like natural carbon sequestering, quote unquote, machines. But there's not a lot of interest in that, because that would mean that you have to come into terms with the current consumptive behavior that we operate within, like, in the capitalist society. So I guess my question then would be like, is the left necessarily just trying to, in some way greenwash capitalism with techno fixes, or are we actually going to like reckon with our behavior of how we interact with the environment, right? And I think if you understand biology, or if you understand your relationship with the environment in a dialectical manner, then I don't think you can just be like, okay, so we can just do whatever the hell we are doing, but let's just invent or put money into R&D for some technology that can allow us to keep doing whatever we're doing, right? And in terms of Silicon Valley, that's like, a lot of those people are dumping a lot of money into these geoengineering projects, and I understand it. Like, we have to be able to.
They're doing that. They're revealingly doing that and trying to escape the planet.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, they're like, okay, so this is fucked. Let's just like fly away to Mars, right? So our experiment's over, or something like that. But I mean, that's the thing. I think they exist on a different material reality from the rest of us, right? So, and I think Ajay Singh Chowdhury wrote really good article on this. Like, there is no collective we in this climate movement, right? So William Nordhaus can say, okay, yeah, 4 degrees Celsius rise is acceptable, and a part of humanity will survive, but that means that he and the elites are willing to risk, or like basically put to death millions of people, just so that they don't have to change anything, or they don't have to restructure the economy and
Which
stuff
is
like that.
precisely the same calculus that we see right now with COVID.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to finish by talking about science worker organizing and ask what science worker organizing looks like today. Who are you trying to organize, and to what end? And in what ways is that a continuation of what the original Science for the People was trying to do, and to what extent is it somewhat different?
So I understand from the older the past Science for the People movements is that they were more of like an anti-war movement, and there wasn't a lot of conscious worker unionization efforts, from what I understand. There was some efforts to unionize scientists, but it didn't really go very far. I think like in Britain, there was an International Academic Workers Union, or I forget the abbreviation for it, but Steve and Hillary Rose writes about that. But today in America, like, I think the center point of Science for the People's organizing is helping graduate students organize. And I can speak a little bit about it in Boston, but also UC, in the UC system, right? And these are not necessarily driven by Science for the People. It's just like it's a realization by graduate students themselves about how their labor is being exploited. And scientists, for the most part, it is odd that we don't have solidarity with our counterparts in humanities or social sciences. It just boggles my mind, because when I was in graduate school, in between 2013 to 2019, in the beginning, there was so much excitement because, the NLR, the National Labor Relations Board, had overturned this decision that graduate students are not workers. And suddenly graduate students were realizing there was like a building of class consciousness, and like there was a lot of organizing efforts happening in Northeastern, at Tufts University, at Harvard, and these are still continuing. But a lot of the time, they have faced a lot of difficulties, but there was so much excitement at that time to realize that we are all in solidarity with each other. And that solidarity also did not limit themselves to students. It spread to staff who were organizing, for example, the dining hall staff or the custodial staff who were organizing for unions or demanding better work environments and stuff. And I think that was so critical because it really showed that was like for me, the realization, yeah, this is like people are finally realizing that there's power in a union and that we are all workers, right? Like our labor is being exploited, and not just in some lofty ideals of science, but for like profiteering purposes by the institutions where we work, right? So there's that I feel like that's the current Science for the People worker movement. Yeah, so I can only speak as far as that.
In the original Science for the People, I've read that a core organizing challenge was extending the project beyond the academy and into industry. But what I've heard from a lot of grad student organizers over the years is that science PhD students are often among the hardest to organize. What accounts for this divide between science grad students and those who are in the humanities or social sciences, and this perception that science grad students are more conservative or more bought into the status quo, and how might that be overcome?
Yeah, I think that's that what you just described it's definitely true. I personally, as a science PhD student, can attest to that because in my conversations with my colleagues or like my cohort, there was really no first, there was no recognition of like a class difference, and also there was, the makeup of science PhDs usually are definitely more aligned with the status quo, and they're financially more comfortable considering the amount of funding we get. In a lot of schools, like in my school, we didn't have to teach, so there was really no impetus for organizing on common grounds. It was basically just like, oh, we're getting paid well, we don't have to teach students, so we can just do our research, right? And I think that's like the mantra, the individualist new liberal mantra that's been like drilled into your head, is that you just need to work on yourself. And I think it might be Eric Olin, right, who described this as like contradictory class positions, right? And also I think there, although it's got a lot of different names, but I think I personally would say it's like the professional managerial class kind of situation here, where your class interests like are more aligned with the status quo rather than your fellow workers who are in a less financially comfortable position, right? So I think, to overcome this contradictory class position, there has to be other aspects rather than just funding. And I think, there has to be a cultivation of solidarity, a cultivation of class consciousness within science PhDs, and part of it comes also from like understanding what your science is being used for, right? So in the recent times, there's been this whole rise in the use of PhD, right, as a critical skill, right? So right now, PhDs are being marketed as like having learned the skill of critical thinking, as having learned the skill of critical reading or comprehension or time management or whatever it is that is applicable for a wide variety of jobs. And this is happening because the academic job market is, even for science PhDs, is like drying up, right? So when I was in grad school, we were given courses or like we were given workshops on how to market yourself as to non-academic jobs or like even non-research jobs. And if you look at the rise of consulting companies in biotech in the city of Boston in the last 5 years, you'll see that there's just been such a boom of biotech consulting, and a lot of even my cohort, I think a handful of them went into actual industry or academic research, and majority of them went into like non-research related jobs as PhDs. So there's obviously the allure of like a science PhD to have for upward mobility, easier upward mobility compared to humanities and social sciences. And I think
there's a deeper history there as well. I don't know if you've read the book Don't Blame Us. It's a history of the Route 128 suburbs
I actually
by Lily Geismer, a historian. It's an excellent book. And it's about the rise of suburban new democratic politics in Boston's Route 128 suburbs, which is, for those listeners who don't know, a tech hub. And I've also done an interview with Lily Geismer for those who want to find it in the archives. But tech workers are a big part of the story. And she writes that while they played a big role, an important role in the area's anti-war movement and other progressive fights, that they were also kind of skeptical and even hostile to organized labor, and that they went on to form a key constituency behind the rise of Atari Democrats like Michael Dukakis and New Democrats like Bill Clinton.
Yeah, so I am, like I said, I'm not familiar with that work, but when on the talk of tech workers, Boston is still a big tech hub, right? And it's like now a biotech hub, but there's also other tech companies here. And one thing that happened was, like I think last year there was a big walkout of the online furniture retail company, right?
Yeah, but it was the walkout resisting their collaboration with ICE, right?
Yes, they were providing beds for ICE detention centers. And actually, one of the main organizers of that walkout was a Boston Democratic Socialists of America member who sort of organized the workers to, leading the walkout, right? And there was a lot of graduate students, both from science and non-science fields there, particularly Science for the People's local chapters did participate in it. So there's definitely, a lot of like current Science for the People efforts, like especially, I mean, even beyond Science for the People efforts, like just in general, graduate student organizing or faculty, adjunct faculty organizing is also a big thing. So all of that kind of overlaps or could be considered as a part of like a broader movement in like worker mobilization in the technology field in general, right? Which happened with the which we are seeing pushing back against collaboration with ICE, or even with the Pentagon, like Google's Project Maven. There was like a big walkout protest over that, and also in Microsoft too.
My last question is about tech worker organizing, which, as you mentioned, resistance to involvement in immigration enforcement, it's military work, sexual harassment on the job. And Ben Tarnoff wrote about this in a recent essay for Logic, a really great lengthy essay on tech worker organizing. And he writes about how many tech workers have a contradictory class position with an orientation to both the working class and the bourgeoisie simultaneously in different contradictory ways. Tech workers, he writes, are, quote, members of the middle layers who have the potential to be either friends or enemies of a working class-led socialist movement. By virtue of their position between labor and capital, they inhabit what Eric Olin Wright famously called contradictory class locations. Their class condition is a combination of bourgeois and proletarian elements, which means they are pulled in two directions. They can focus on the ways in which they are bourgeois and identify with the capitalist class, or they can focus on the ways in which they are proletarian and forge alliances with the working class. The tech worker movement offers a fascinating illustration of many members of the middle layers coming to see themselves as workers. My last question is, with that in mind, what does the recent wave of tech worker organizing reveal about the class position and complicated political potential of science workers in particular, as I guess part of, some have called, the professional managerial class in general?
It's also part of it is what's like Gabriel Winnet calls chronopolitics. Like it also depends on age. One thing is that there's an increasing realization that whatever the current system is, whether you identify as a socialist or a social democrat or liberal, you understand that there's something is not working, right? And this is being so much more exacerbated by the pandemic situation and like the way it's being handled and the disparate effects on different communities, right? And this is all very publicly being exposed, right? So the hope there is that it will lead to some form of radicalization where scientists who occupy contradictory class locations, like you mentioned, will advocate for a more radical political program rather than just saying we should, tone it down or something like that. And I think I guess I'm pretty optimistic because I just for whatever reason, but I do hope that it turns out to be that way. And, when I talk to emerging scientists, right, like, or early career scientists, they all understand that the bottleneck that we're living in, like academic jobs are drying up. There's not a lot of security in the future, even if you're a scientist, right? Like, and when you look at how capitalism moves through boom and bust cycles, the biotech boom is going to come to an end, right? And the consulting boom is going to come to an end. So all of this needs to become more mainstream conversation. Is like, do we realize where we are headed? And of course, the climate crisis is like is obviously looming in the background, right? So there is hope, that this moment can be used for a radical transformation, and the way you use it, it depends on like how much energy you put into like organizing, and I think that is going to be very key.
Well, one quick follow-up, is that the power of the tech monopolies appears to only be growing stronger and stronger amid the current crisis. So how do tech workers, as science workers within the most powerful and valuable countries in the world, what role can their organizing play in supporting a broader working class led movement further down the supply chain? I'm thinking both in terms of tech manufacturing workers in places like Shenzhen, but also like retail in the US. They're not just workers with a contradictory class location, but they're workers with a contradictory class location within companies that effectively also have massive working classes.
I think so. If I remember correctly, there's a large portion of these tech monopolies that operate as contract workers, right? So they do not get the benefits of a full-time employee. And I think one of the greatest things that was happening based on Ben Turnov's article is that he writes about how the full-time workers were also interacting with the contract workers in terms of going on strike, right? So obviously, when there's a strike, the first thing is like, don't be a scab, don't cross the picket line, right? So I think that sense of solidarity needs to exist between the tech workers on both sides. And also the other part is and a good example would be like Uber and Lyft, right? So the gig economy has created this endless supply of labor for these companies, but also it is their critically like, it is their critical point. And I think there's another really good essay in Logic about this, is that because the companies are so reliant on this labor force, that if the labor force can organize against the companies, that essentially, will bring them down to their knees. And I think that sort of that power, even if we can string together these separate movements together somehow, and through like just the general understanding that this company is screwing everybody, right, except for the top paying executives, right? The Uber driver, or like even the retail worker who works at a restaurant where a driver is picking up food for Grubhub or Uber Eats, and the guy on the developer back end understands that we are putting these people at risk for the profit of the company, not the restaurant, not the guy who's making the delivery, not even the developer who's probably, and based on a contract, like he's just trying to maintain his job security at this point without even proper benefits. And this precarity is like what ties us together, and that could be used to cultivate a solidarity across supply chains, across like contradictory class positions, because ultimately, the goal for the corporation is to maximize profit at the highest level and at the cost of the labor force.
Well, Nafis Hasan, thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you. This was such a pleasure.
Nafis Hasan is a postdoctoral researcher at Tufts University working on brain tumors, and an organizer with the Boston chapters of DSA and Science for the People. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that nature is man's inorganic body, that is to say, nature is so far as it is not the human body. Man lives from nature, and he must maintain a continuing dialogue with it if he is not to die. To say that man's physical and mental life is linked to nature simply means that nature is linked to itself, for man is a part of nature. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, Our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Julia Rock and Zachary Nin. Our senior advisor is Thea Riofrancos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it is on iTunes, you can also leave us a glowing review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is telling your friends about the show. Please do make propaganda for us. And please do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is a big help.